Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about 4 settings that I like to disable at the beginning of my macro and then I re-enable them. They are screen updating, display alerts, enable events, and calculations. And the reason I do that is for performance and also to ensure that the macro will run smoothly and uninterrupted. So let's head over to VBA, Alt F11. First one I'm going to talk about is screen updating. Now by default this is enabled. Now you may have a macro that, for example, copies data from one worksheet to another, perhaps to another workbook, and you may notice that Excel will quickly switch between the sheets and the workbook, and if you have enough of that it can become quite distracting. It can also impact performance. Now I've got some code here that's going to simulate that. Now you don't have to understand the code, but if you notice that your macro is exhibiting similar behavior, you can disable it by setting the screen updating setting to false. But I'll just quickly explain what this is doing. It's opening a workbook and then it's going to loop through rows 1 to 5,000 in column A and set a value in each cell. And then it closes the workbook. So nothing too exciting, but it's enough to show you the behavior I was talking about. So at the moment, we're going to leave it as the default, which is the screen will update. And as the user, they would run it from Excel rather than from VBA. So you'll notice once I click the button, you'll see the workbook open and quickly populate some data and then close. And there, it's done. Now, that scenario wasn't too bad and you could probably just live with it. I always like to disable it. That's your choice. But if there is a lot more, then I highly recommend disabling the screen updating until the very end. So we're going to do that right now. So before the main macro, I usually do it after I've declared the variables. You set it to false. So application.screenUpdating equals false. And at the very end, once the macro is done, I like to re-enable it. Now this should reset automatically, at the very least when you reopen the workbook, but I like to reset it anyway. Well, now we'll head back over and the user runs the process. And there it is. There is no flickering, it's much more smoother. So the next setting is display alerts. And with that, whenever you perform certain actions in Excel, it's going to prompt you to confirm. So for example, if you delete a worksheet or try to override an existing file. Now that's fine if you're doing it manually from Excel, but you don't want the process to be interrupted when you're running it via a macro. On top of that, the user shouldn't be burdened with the choice of whether they should be proceeding with that deletion or override or whatever it is. It should be handled by the macro. So I've got an example here. Again, you don't need to understand the code, but I'll just explain to you what it's doing. It's going to create a new workbook. It's going to add a sheet, then delete it. And this is where Excel will ask you to confirm. Then I'm going to save that new workbook using a file name that already exists. And again, I'll be greeted with the confirmation prompt. And then after that, the workbook is closed. So as the user, I'm going to run it from the button here. And you'll see a couple of prompts appear. So the first one we get is do we want to continue and permanently delete the sheet? So I'm going to say yes. Now I'll get another prompt. Do you want to override the file? I'm going to say yes. You don't really want the user to have to make this choice. And so we can disable that by using this statement, application.displayalerts equals to false. And again, at the very end, we're going to re-enable it. This should reset, but I like to do it just to be safe. So let's run it again, and it will just run without any input required. And there you go, it's done. Now you probably noticed the flicker because I didn't disable screen updating for that particular macro there. The next setting we're going to look at is enable events. So whenever you perform certain actions in Excel, it's going to trigger various events. And you can trap some of these and add some code that will be actioned whenever the event occurs. So for example, in the workbook open event, you could set the default worksheet that appears whenever the workbook opens. Now in this example, I've added a drop down with the values yes and no. Now I'm also trapping the worksheet change event. So whenever the user changes the value of the drop down, it's going to trigger that event, and the code that I've added will display a message if the value of the drop down is blank. Now event handling isn't really the focus of this video, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. I may put together something in the future, so be on the lookout for that. Now I'll just quickly show you what's happening behind the event. So if you double click on your sheet here, I do have the worksheet change event, and the target is the cell that was changed. Because it's at the worksheet level, it's going to trap any cell that was changed. So this first line of code just checks that the cell that was changed is the drop down one. If it is, and the value is blank, it's going to pop up a message. All right, otherwise it won't do anything. Enable events, by default, it is true. So what will happen is, if I change the value manually, there's no issue here. If I set it to blank, we get the pop-up. Comes here, please select the value from the drop-down. So this came from that event handling code. And that's fine if you're doing this manually. However, when you're running from a macro, in some cases you don't want the event to be triggered. Especially in this case, we've got a message box. We don't want the macro to be interrupted in case there's more code after it. So let's go to my example. All I'm doing here is I'm just setting the value of the drop down to blank. Now it's going to trigger that event. So I'll show you this happening. So we're going to click the button and we will see the message box if this is blank. So first it's going to do it because I've done it manually. All right, so now so it is blank. If I click on the button, it's going to pop up that message again. All right, in this case, we didn't want that to happen. All right, done. So let's go back to our code and we can disable that by doing application.enable events false. And again, set it back to true, just to be sure in case it doesn't reset on its own. This time, when I run the macro, it's blank, but it's not going to pop up that message. Here we go. And the macro finished without asking me to enter a value. Of course, that all depends on what your macro is doing and whether you want to trigger that event or not. So you'll have to decide that for yourself. The last setting I want to talk about is calculations. Now, in most cases, you're going to have this set to automatic. So whenever you make changes in worksheets, formulas will automatically recalculate. With macros, however, I like to set them to manual at the very beginning, and then at the very end, I'll reset it to automatic. And that's purely for performance reasons. Now, of course, this is going to depend on how much data you have how many formulas you have, which cells they have dependencies on, and which one of those are affected by your macro, and also the complexity of your formulas. For something very simple, disabling the calculation is not going to have any impact. So in this example I have here, we've got some data and very simple formula for total. It just sums from January to April for each row. Now my macro is going to delete all these rows. It's going to open a workbook, copy this data back, and then because the entire rows have been deleted, we've lost the formulas. And so it's going to copy this reference formula up the top and paste it down. So let's take a look at the code that is going to automate that. Now you don't have to understand this in detail. If your macro seems to be sluggish, then you may want to consider setting your calculations to manual at the very start and then running the code and resetting it to automatic at the very end. So I'm just going to run it first with the default. Mine is set to automatic. Run and it's done. So if we have a look, we've got our data again, and in here you can see we've copied the formulas. All right, so that's with the calculations on automatic by default. Now I'm going to turn off the calculations, and then at the very end I'm going to set it back to automatic. Now it's important to note that with calculations they don't reset like the other settings do. So if your macro fails somewhere before this statement here, you'll be left with the calculations set to manual, and you'll have to either manually put it back to automatic or run the code. So with this, I usually put these in error handlers, which means whether there is an error or not, it will always run this bit of code. Now I'll be talking about error handlers in another video which is coming up very soon, so please be on the lookout for that. So we have manual calculations. We're going to open our workbook. We've got our source and destination sheets. We're going to delete the existing data, our source destination ranges. We're copying the source, pasting it into the destination, and close the workbook. And then we've got our reference formula up the very top, and the destination is the totals column, the rows below the header. And then we're going to copy the source and paste it, just as we were doing before, except this time the calculations are turned off. So now I'm going to run it again. We should get the same results as we did before. Again, we've got our data and we have our formulas. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very simple formula, not much data. So setting manual is not going to really have any performance improvement, any changes. So for something simple, you can decide for yourself whether you should do it. Now, a couple of things you need to keep in mind is if for some reason you need to replace the formulas with values after they've been pasted, you need to make sure that you re-enable the calculations before you do that. So for example, let's say copy here, we paste it down here, and then we replace these with values for some reason. I tend to do that when there's a lot of data and complex formulas. Once the macro is finished, if you see that the workbook is a bit sluggish when you use it because of so many formulas, maybe complex formulas, I like to replace them with values and stick whatever formulas there were, I just put them in the top. And then when I update the data, I paste the formulas back down. So one thing you need, as I mentioned, you need to be careful of is setting this back. Otherwise, you'll end up with zeros. And I'll just demonstrate that now. So here, before I reset it to automatic, we're going to copy the pasted formulas and then paste special as values, and that will replace the formulas. And then you'll see what result we get. Calculations. We no longer have the formulas because we put values, but we've lost the actual totals. So let's change this and fix it. We put our calculations to automatic before we replace with values. Let's run it again, and this time we should get the correct totals. So we have the correct totals, but there are no formulas there. The formula is up the top. So if this is the only formula that you're copying and pasting and replacing with values, then it doesn't really make sense to turn off the calculations. But if, let's say, you had other columns with formulas that you're copying and pasting the formulas down, you may want to turn it off there, and then before you do the replace with values, then turn it back on. Again, as I mentioned before, if this fails somewhere before you've set it back to automatic, you'll manually have to set it back, or you'll have to run the code again with that set to automatic. So that's it for all the individual settings. I just want to show you one thing that I usually do, and that is I group all the settings into a subroutine. I call it disable settings, and I pass it a parameter. If disable is true, it will disable all the settings. If it's false, it will re-enable them. And the way I use it is in the parent subroutine or function. I call disable settings true at the very beginning to disable everything, then the main code, and at the very end, disable settings false to re-enable it. If you have a child subroutine or function that gets called by the parent, you don't need to disable and re-enable them there. This will be handled by the parent. You don't need to do this for every single subroutine and function. It just depends on the complexity. Think about the performance, whether the macro is running smoothly without any interruptions from end to end, as I mentioned before. And then you can decide which settings to enable or disable, and whether you should just do them all in one go, as I've done here. Well, that wraps it up. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.